You're going to go all the way in the front. I'm going to go right here. Good evening. I'm County Supervisor Joe Simidian, and once again, my office is very pleased to co-host this program with the Mountain View Human Relations Commission. And by the way, a special thanks to the City of Mountain View and the city staff in particular for hosting us yet again in this marvelous Center for the Performing Arts. Would you please join me in thanking them? I am delighted to welcome such a robust crowd yet again for this, our second program in the series. And let me say right now that I hope very much that you will join us at the third and final program in the series, which is Monday, April 30th. That's next Monday, same time, 7 p.m., and same place right here at the Performing Arts Center. As those of you who were here last week know, and let me just see, how many of you were with us last week? Show. Okay. All right. Well, welcome back. As those of you who will remember from last week will recall, we really do look forward to taking your questions, and you should have been handed a question card when you walked in the room. If you would like to ask a question, simply fill it out, raise your hand, and someone will come by, either a member of the staff or the Human Relations Commission will come by and collect it. Let me also ask again that you try and focus your questions on tonight's topic, which is women and Islam. Our program next week will focus on fear of a faith, Sharia, surveillance, terrorism, the Muslim ban, what's real and what's not, and we plan to address those issues in depth at that time. Our conversation this evening is being taped by KMVT, yet again, for broadcast at a later date. So one more time, we want to ask that all cell phones be turned to silent. This is that moment. All cell phones, please turn to silent. And again, if it buzzes or beeps or rings or pings, this is the time to turn it off. Also, I know at the last session we had some challenges with the sound and the volume. We've tried to rectify that this evening, and I'm sure you'll give us your feedback as you did last week. That was not a pun. I'm sure you'll give us your feedback as you did last week. But also I should mention that there are assisted listening devices available in the lobby for those who would like them. You do have to head back there, though, to get one. And finally, one last bit of housekeeping. Under California state law, I'm obliged to tell you that in the unlikely event of an emergency, there are exits, and you should go to them. There are 2 in the back, 2 on the front and sides, and that should keep us all safe in the unlikely event of an emergency. So now on to the program that you've all come to participate in, and again, we thank you. As I mentioned last week, I think we are lucky to live in one of the most diverse places in the country. But without understanding the diverse cultures amongst us, misconceptions will abound. So our goal tonight is simple: to create a better understanding of Islam among the general public. And so let me begin by introducing tonight's panelists, both of whom were with us last week, and we thank them for the return. Anita Hussain is the Associate Dean and Director of the Markaz Center at Stanford University. Before coming to Stanford, Anita was a lecturer in the Near Eastern Studies Department at Princeton University, and before that, she worked in the Arabic programs at the University of Texas at Austin, as well as at Georgia State University. She received her bachelor's degree in Middle Eastern and South Asian Studies from Emory University, spent 2 years in the Peace Corps as a health education volunteer in Morocco, and then received her MA in Arabic Studies from the University of Texas at Austin. I should mention, just prior to what we often refer to as the Arab Spring, the Arab Uprisings, Anita had a fellowship in Cairo, Egypt, with the Center for Arabic Studies Abroad, where she served as the personal translator and interpreter for the president of Al-Azhar University, both before and during his transition from university president to Sheikh of Al-Azhar. Please join me in welcoming her and thanking her for being with us tonight. And then also back with us again is Maha El-Jannati. Maha is the executive director and founder of the Islamic Networks Group, ING. She received her undergraduate degree in political science and economics from the American University in Cairo. She got her master's degree in religious studies just down the road at Stanford University. She's been recognized with many awards, and the one I like to highlight is the Civil Rights Leadership Award from the California Association of Human Relations Organizations. Please thank her for joining us yet again. And now I'm going to step back into the chair, and I'm going to begin with a very basic and direct question that has come up more than a few times in the earlier conversations, and that is, are men and women equal? Are men and women equal in the view of Islam and in the view of God? Who'd like to tackle that one just to get us started?
You want me to do it?
Uh-huh.
Okay. So thank you for the invitation again, and thank you, Joe, for holding these programs, which I think are incredibly important in the political environment that we're in, when we have polls that indicate that majorities of Americans have very negative views of Islam and Muslims. So are men and women equal according to Islam and according to God? So I don't know God's mind, but I can tell you that, that as far as Muslims are concerned, it really depends on who you ask. And the reason that I say that, is that there are, and I mentioned this last time, and a lot of you were here last time, so you can recall this, that there are 2 billion Muslims in the world that live in 57 Muslim majority countries, not counting all the sizable minority populations that we have around the world, including here in the United States. So it really depends on who you ask. An American Muslim would say absolutely men and women are equal in the eyes of God, and according to our reading of scripture, of both the Quran and other sources of Islam, and they would cite things like God created both men and women from the same spiritual source or spiritual essence. So they're equal in their human nature. They've also been given what Muslims call the fitrah, which is the primordial human nature which gives them dignity, and it's been given equally to both men and women and all human beings that are created by God. And so they're equal in their spiritual nature. They're equal in their relationship to God. They're equal in their responsibilities towards God. Human beings are considered to be trustees of God on earth. They're going to be held accountable the same way, same heaven and hell for both men and women, and on and on and on. So these are just a few of the rights that we can talk about.
Anita, if I were to ask you that question, which I have, what would your reaction be?
I think insofar as anything separate can be equal in any lived society, sure, men and women are equal. But I would just question the notion that any 2 different entities could ever be treated equally. I would question whether or not men are equal in American society, in other religious traditions, and in other societies anyway. So I think it's there are inherent differences between men and women, and that plays out in different ways. To answer your question in a simple way, I would say, my understanding of Islam is that men and women are equal in the eyes of God. My understanding of Muslim communities is like most communities where things get interpreted in different ways, and there are a lot of inequalities between men and women in all societies I've had the privilege to experience.
But as a matter of faith, as a matter of doctrine, are men or women in any way held up as privileged or superior or dominant?
An American Muslim would say no. They're both considered to be equally privileged, equally dominant, equal before God, in every possible way. So it really depends on.
Excuse the interruption, but you were very purposeful, I noted, in saying an American Muslim, and of course that means that, and you've shared before the importance of understanding the diversity among the 2 billion Muslim adherents around the country. But
right.
would Muslims in other countries or other communities have a different take on this? And is that about faith or culture? We're back to the old question.
Right, so it's a bit of both. You can't separate faith from culture because religion is interpreted through the lens of culture. And then when you add things like mental health, family upbringing, educational level, class, and all of those factors would contribute to the way that people would interpret this question. So you would get a lot of diversity. It's like asking, Joe, do all Christians agree on the equality of men and women throughout the world? Because you have societies, Christian societies in places like Brazil, in Mexico, in the Congo, in China, in Russia. These are all Christian majority countries. Do they all have the same opinion on Christianity and what Christianity says on the rights of men and women?
And Anita, you too have traveled in other parts of the world, done your work in other parts of the world, studied other parts of the world. What's your take on the distinction between the American Muslim perspective and the views and values of Muslims in other parts of the globe?
Sure. So I lived in a very small village in Morocco when I was in the Peace Corps, and I lived in Cairo, Egypt, one of the biggest cities in the world, when I was in grad school. And so the major difference, I mean, they're both Muslim-majority countries, they're both Arab countries in Middle East, North Africa, and the major difference in my experience was really about a small town versus a big city. So my experience in a small town of Morocco was that because it was an agrarian community, most people didn't go get educated beyond what the elementary school that was available in this small town. A lot of people still didn't have electricity and running water. And when families did have financial means to pay for a child to go get educated, they would usually educate the boys, not the girls. So there was definitely differences between men and women in Morocco that stemmed out of education in this small town. When I lived in Cairo, I was living in downtown Cairo with a bunch of artists and intellectuals and journalists and actors and activists. And
so you're hanging out with a bad crowd is what you're telling us.
Maybe,
Okay.
I guess,
All right,
yeah.
so-
And you know, there were lots of men, women. It didn't feel as though there was much limitations in access to education, jobs, staying out late, safety, security. Of course, this was all before the Arab Spring. So the main difference was small town versus big city. So I think it comes back to Maha's point, which is like it's interpreted by culture. And in more kind of urban cultures with a lot of diversity where people kind of leave the small town and come to big cities and have anonymity, there was a lot more gender equality than in a small town where everybody knows everyone.
You mentioned in passing, and I want to go to it for just a moment, the fact that both Morocco and Egypt were predominantly Arab nations. And quite common for folks to confuse Arab and Muslim and to conflate the two. So of those 2 billion Muslims around the globe, what percentage of them are Arab and what percentage of them are not?
Only 15% are Arab.
Would you say that again, Maha?
Only 15% of the 2 billion Muslims are Arab.
So when we're
And
having
Arabs-
conversations about geopolitics, which our panelist Jihad did the last time, important to distinguish between faith, Islam, and
Arabs, which are ethnic identity.
ethnic
They're-
identities, or
They're
even
Semitic people. They trace their roots back to the prophet Abraham, like the Jewish people do. Their language is Semitic, which is the Arabic language. They're distinct from the Muslim identity. And not all Arabs are Muslims, right? In the Middle East, you have about 15 to 20% of Arabs are Christian or Jewish, which is different than the Arabs here in the United States. The Arabs here in the United States, 70% are going to be Christians, and that has to do with immigration policy. The people that we allowed here in the United States must have been only Christians from that part of the world, seriously. But 15 to 20% of Arabs in the Middle East are not going to be Muslim. They're going to be Christians, or they're going to be Jewish or of other religious backgrounds.
So let me go right to some of the hot button issues when it comes to issues of gender and Islam. And I know, or I suspect I know, that it's a challenge for you all when notions of gender in Islam are primarily driven by what people know or think they know about either Saudi Arabia or the Taliban, and that is the characterization. So we very quickly get to conversation about honor killings. We get to a very difficult conversation about female genital mutilation, FGM. We get to the conversation about attire, which we began last week, and whether or not these things are somehow driven by faith as a part of Islam. So let's start with the notion of honor killings. Do honor killings have any foundation in Islam or in any significant view of Islam with which you're familiar?
No.
Okay.
They don't, and I think that we need to also recognize that honor killings don't just take place. Honor killings, I'm
There you go.
sorry. It must be me. I usually don't, I'm never told that I have a soft voice. This is the first time, that this seems to be happening here on stage. Okay, so no, honor killings don't just happen in some Muslim majority countries. They take place in India, in China, in Latin American countries. And this is something that the American public needs to understand. It's that this is a crime against women. It is a violent crime against women, and violent crimes take place everywhere in the world, including the United States. You've all been reading about the untested rape cases that are happening in the United States. So I looked this up because I was really intrigued by this, and I found that there are top 10 countries that have the highest rates of rape. Do you know which one is the number one country that has the highest rate of rape? The United States. And of the top 10 countries, it includes European countries, France, Germany, and the UK. It includes South Africa, it includes India, it includes Sri Lanka. None of those top 10 countries are Muslim majority countries. So we need to understand that honor killing has nothing to do with any religion, even though the people that commit these crimes claim religion. It's violence against women. And
Well, you made
I'm assuming that everybody knows what an honor killing is.
an important point there, which is you said even though the people who do these killings claim they are religious. So is it accurate then to say that there are those who engage in so-called honor killings who use Islam as the rationale?
I don't know necessarily that they use Islam as a rationale in most of these cases. I think that the media reports about them as if they have to do with the religion of Islam. But I'm not sure that the families will claim culture, that this individual dishonored our family and our culture and our reputation, but I'm not sure that they necessarily claim Islam in all cases.
I think some of the argument revolves around the fact that honor killings are sometimes predicated on claims of adultery, claims of apostasy, and that these are called out in the Quran, and therefore the two get connected or conflated. Anita, do you have any background experience or take on this?
No, I think that a lot of crimes and things are done in names of religions, Islam and otherwise, that don't have any sort of textual or like liturgical basis in the religion. I think honor killings is one of them.
All right. Female genital mutilation, sometimes called cutting. Microphone.
Same thing. It has absolutely nothing to do with the religion of Islam. It is a practice that existed, that predated the religion of Islam, and it's happening throughout Africa, and it's happening in some of the North African countries, which are Muslim majority countries. But it's a violation of Islamic law, and the reason that is because anything that would inhibit a woman from experiencing pleasure in sexual intimacy would be considered forbidden. Islam actually addresses the importance of a woman being satisfied in a sexual relationship with her spouse. It actually addresses this. I'm not sure if there are any other religions that do. I'm not familiar with that, but in Islam it actually does. So if if circumcision or cutting, FGM, is gonna, and it does, and it inhibits a woman from enjoying intimacy, then it would be absolutely prohibited and forbidden, and it is.
What about that phenomenon in the American Muslim community?
I can speak to that.
Please.
So I think FGM is a little bit more complicated than honor killings, and pardon me, I'm going to get a little bit scientific with it. So there are different types. FGM is an acronym that's used to label different types of practices, some a lot more intrusive than others. The least intrusive form of FGM is the equivalent to the female's clitoris to what is done in male circumcision to a man's penis. So that is the removal, a slight removal of the hood of the clitoris. It would be the kind of same action that is done in male circumcision. That least intrusive female genital mutilation practice is justified by a very small community within a small minority of Shia Muslims that I happen to be a part of that community. So I can speak to this a little bit in a personal way. So within my community, which is about like 1 million people in the world, there is an interpretation of the text that Maha cites about women's pleasure that says that actually this practice enhances a woman's ability to be pleased, in the same way that people make the argument that male circumcision enhances a man's ability to have pleasure. So in that interpretation, there is a community that is still not banning the practice and people in the community making religious justifications for that practice, and that practice is continuing, and that has hit the media kind of more recently. There's a lawsuit in the United States, in Michigan. There is lawsuits in Australia against doctors that are carrying this practice out.
And the Michigan case was just last year, if I remember correctly?
Yep.
Okay. Do you worry that that kind of publicity will misinform the broader American public about the tenets of Islam?
I think that everything's nuanced, and it's a nuance that...
the media isn't always nuanced.
The media is not nuanced. That's why we have these kinds of conversations to hopefully address it. So, you know, I think the majority of Muslims, besides this 1 million, the rest of the whatever billion, 3 billion, would say this community is doing things wrong. This is not the interpretation of that text. This is not an Islamic practice. This 1 million, within this 1 million, there are a lot of people that are coming out and saying, you know what, this doesn't make sense. Let's re-examine this. A lot of people are publicly disobeying or silently disobeying that interpretation, but it is happening, and it is part of one Muslim interpretation.
All right. Back to the issue of attire, in part because attire is so obviously visible, thank you, and is a thing that people notice right away. So we've got the hijab, the niqab, the burqa. Let's start with, Anita, what are those 3 terms refer to in your understanding and experience?
Okay, sure. Hijab is generally understood as somebody who is covering, like Maha, most of their body except for maybe their hands, their feet, and their face. Now, how they do that with what types of cloth there's lots of different words for lots of different cloths. So I would call Maha's headscarf a headscarf or a veil. A burqa would be a long coat type outfit that would cover the entire body, and then you could wear a headscarf with a burqa. Sometimes, are there headscarves attached to burqas? Oh, it would also cover the face. I was thinking niqab covers the face. And then niqab would also cover the face, so just the eyes are visible.
Yeah. There's a lot of different definitions because the burqa in Afghanistan
And
would
again,
also
a little
cover.
louder, please, right into that microphone.
There's differences in the definitions of these terms. It really depends on how you use them. But the burqa in Afghanistan also includes covering the face.
Okay. And we're back to our age-old question. Is this about religion, or
Yeah.
is this about culture?
So
Understanding
modesty,
the
yeah.
inexorable, interwoven nature of the two.
Yeah, modesty is what is intended by the dress. That's the, sort of that is what is taught, what is required of both men and women. Modesty not only in dress, but also modesty in your interaction with the opposite gender, because sexuality or intimacy follows marriage, and so modesty is observed. Is supposed to be observed by Muslims. The form that it takes really depends on the individual, on the community, on the region of the country, of the world, on different interpretations. So there's a lot of diversity with that.
So to grossly oversimplify a very complicated, nuanced subject, is it fair to say that Islam calls on Islamic women to be
Both
modest?
men and women.
Men and women.
Both
but
men and women to be
the title
modest.
tonight is Women in Islam, so I'll come back to, but I will come back to that.
Well, no, it's important because we're
No, I
trying, we're
understand.
trying to counter stereotypes. This requirement is not just for women, it's for both men and women.
I'm going to get to the men in a minute, I promise.
Yeah.
But is it fair to say that the call to modesty is embedded in the faith,
Absolutely.
but that the definition of modesty will have 2 billion different interpretations, and that
Absolutely.
different women and men will interpret the call to modesty in different ways? Is
Exactly.
that okay? Fair enough.
Exactly.
Then let's get to the men. Are the men likewise called to modesty by their faith?
Absolutely. The same requirement also falls on men. In terms of dress, it's also interpreted differently, right? There's a requirement that you have to absolutely cover from the waist down to the knee. But in other cultures, it is to dress modestly. So you'll find that a lot of American Muslim clergy or imams will not wear their shirts tucked into their pants, but they'll wear long shirts like you see me wearing that almost comes down to their knees, and they'll wear a skull cap, they'll grow their beard. So even with men's dress, it's based on interpretation and based on the culture that they represent.
Anita, thoughts on this subject? Men and women and the call to modesty.
Yeah, generally I've understood, the male interpretation of what to cover is navel to knee as well. I think I'll reiterate what I said last week, which is, for me, modesty, my interpretation of modesty is to cast down your gaze. That's the first type of hijab, is the hijab of the eyes. And so it's really about your intention, about how you look at people, how long you look at them, what angles you're looking, and treating people really with human dignity and not as pieces of meat. And I think that's for me, the most important hijab.
Is hijab then a matter of personal choice?
I would say hijab is really like, for me, hijab is really like contextually defined. So to not draw attention to yourself or undue like sexualized attention to yourself is relative, right? So wearing a one-piece on a beach where everyone's wearing a two-piece would be relatively modest. So that's kind of how I interpret it, but I'm more of a relativist, so
I wanna,
so I don't know if most Muslims would agree with me.
No,
All right.
definitely.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely contextualized. And it isn't just about dress. I think it's really important to understand this. It's about behavior with the opposite gender and how you present yourself to the world. Is it in a sexual way or in a dignified, respectful way? That's really what hijab is about. Because there could be people that are dressed as I am, but are not observing modesty in terms of their interaction with the opposite gender. So it's really about interaction. The dress is an added value to that.
Let me ask a question that was written, and I think it's a little provocative, and it kind of pushes this issue a little bit forward. And I'm going to read it verbatim, and forgive me, in many cases I'm trying to cluster 3 or 4 questions together for efficiency. But this one I want to read directly. It says, how is it that and thank you for the good printing, by the way. How is it that contemporary Muslim women still accept a dress code created by men to protect men from feeling stimulated by female beauty? Isn't it time for the men to learn how to manage their own reactions to female beauty?
I don't actually dress this way for men at all. And I think that most believing Muslim women who dress the way that I do don't do it for men at all. I do it for myself. I think this is a very dignified way of dressing. And I'm also a traditionalist, so I do follow the traditional rules on this, which includes covering the hair. So when I wasn't really a practicing Muslim in my youth, I still dressed quite modestly because it was very much part of my culture to sort of dress modestly. The only thing that I added was adding a scarf. But I have never thought of doing this to protect men or to do it for the sake of men. I can care less where the heck men are looking or what they're doing. I can tell you, though, that since I started wearing hijab, and it's been about 25 years, that men do treat me a lot differently. They really do. Because the idea behind it is the concealed sexuality, so that you're not looking at my body parts, you're not looking at my physical appearance, you're treating me based on my character, my behavior, my occupation, my job, my purpose for being there and even talking to you in the first place, and so forth. So sexuality is out of the picture. I was in the corporate world in the 80s and experienced senior women suing companies for sexual harassment left and right. And this happened after the woman that testified against the Supreme Court Justice, Anita Hill. Yeah, it was that age. It was horrible. It was absolutely horrible. I didn't experience that so much in the corporate world. I've always sort of carried myself modestly, and even more so with the hijab, and I like it, and I'm comfortable in the way that I'm dressed. I'm not worried about the way that I look, or whether my clothes fit right or not. This is a really comfortable way of dressing for me, and I like that. And I demand respect based on who I am and my humanity and my what's coming out of my mouth and what I do for a living, not based on whether I'm good looking or not.
All right.
And so that's why I wear hijab, and most believing Muslim women who wear hijab do it for that reason.
Anita, your take on this. I know at Stanford you work with a lot of younger women, Muslim women in particular. I'm wondering what that looks like, and I don't know if she's here tonight, but at our last session, one of my younger constituents was here. Hira, are you here somewhere? Thank you, Hira. Pointed out that we didn't have quite as much, shall we say, generational diversity on the panel as a 16-year-old constituent might have sought out, and so I promised I would ask some questions directed towards the views of younger Muslim Americans. On this issue of dress, what do you experience with the younger Muslim students at the university level? And I know you work outside the university as well. So what's your experience on this topic with younger Muslim Americans?
Sure. I want to get to the heart of this question, and that is, why can't, men cast down their gaze? Why can't men just treat women, regardless of how she's dressed or how anyone is presenting themselves, as a human being? And I think that that I agree completely. I would hope that that's the case. I would hope that older folks in the audience didn't feel like they had to dye their hair to look younger. I would hope that folks that, have certain, we all have like things that we feel society judges us about, whatever is like not perfect about our bodies, and we're always like trying to spend a lot of money on chemicals and surgeries and whatever to fix and gain approval from society. And I'd hope that none of us would have to feel that way at all, and we wouldn't be judged, superficially. So I completely agree with the sentiment in this card, which is, let's all just treat each other with respect, regardless of how we look, how we dress, whether it's sexualized or not. To get to the question about young Muslim women, college-age Muslim women, I'm seeing students come in wearing a headscarf and then taking it off in college. I'm seeing women come in not wearing a headscarf and then putting one on, and going back and forth. And I think that, whether you add another piece of cloth to your wardrobe, sometimes it's really just that fluid. Whether or not you wear socks that morning is for some people it's that fluid of an identity. Some women have gone back and forth. Some women have veiled and not gone back since they started. Some women have never veiled and only do it, when they pray. Some women don't veil and don't veil when they pray either. Some women don't veil and only veil when they're going into the mosque or into certain contexts. So it's really just another piece of cloth. It's a choice of clothing. I think that maybe gets to the question. I want to bring it back also to bring in a youth voice. I'd suggest you look up this comedian. Her name is Hudo Hirsi. She is Toronto-based, just young, up-and-coming stand-up comedian, and talks about being, well, she has to talk about it. She talks about being a veiled Black Muslim woman in the stand-up world, which is really dominated by not veiled Black Muslim women. And she talks about her experiences growing up in Toronto, veiled, and she speaks on it with a lot of humor and a lot of candor of her experiences. And she talks about how, her mom would let her not veil on certain holidays and Eid and stuff like that. Her mom would say, "Oh, why don't we go get your hair done?" And then she wouldn't veil. So she went to some school dance in high school. She was typically the veiled girl in her Toronto high school, shows up to this dance not veiled, and she said that the way that these other teenage boys were looking at her and kind of sexualized her made her realize she didn't want to do that anymore. And so she decided that from then on she wasn't going to, unveil for special occasions. And she's killing it. She's hilarious. She's killing it in the stand-up world, at late night comedy sets and in bars and clubs where she's not drinking and she's not a white guy. And so I think she's an example of a modern day Muslim woman that has embraced both her empowerment and her modesty.
Now, in case she doesn't make it to Shoreline, could you tell us her name again so folks who want to look online can?
Hudo Hirsi. It's Hoodo Hirsi.
All right. And
Hoodo. Like she's wearing a hood, Hudo. And then Hirsi.
great. Now, I want
If she uses that joke, I'm going to get some kickbacks, right?
So, okay. So I'm not going to go down that path, actually. I am, however, going to ask you, back to the subject of being a younger Muslim American, and, it strikes me that younger Muslim Americans have grown up post 9/11 with all that entails. Could you share with the audience a little bit about growing up as a girl, then as a young teenager, teens, and into young womanhood, and what that was like as a Muslim American, and also what you see today that may be different in the cultural and political environment. So why don't we start with Maha, and then we'll come back to Anita.
So I obviously, I'm flattered that you think that I can speak for a teenager, but Muslim women, I can't. But I do know that that they are struggling right now. I mean, they are really my heroes in the country. These young girls that have decided to practice Islam in a very traditional way, and to put on the scarf and go to school every day. They're amazing. They amaze me. And they're so powerful. They're so strong. And we have some of them are here in the audience. But they struggle as well because according to polls, 1 out of 2 in the state of California struggles with teasing, harassment, and bullying. And across the country, it could be as high as 4 out of 5. And so they're dealing with it. They're taking it and they're pushing back. My organization works a lot with Muslim teens by empowering them, enabling them, talking to them about what their rights are, what their rights of their parents are, and then giving them tools to go out and to be able to respond to difficult questions that they're confronted with, giving them presentation tools to also speak up in the classroom and say to the teacher, hey, I can give you a 10 minutes, talk on this or that. And I do know that they struggle, but they're resilient as well, and they're coming out stronger at the end. Growing up as a Muslim American in the United States, this was in the 70s now, and the 80s, I think was a lot different. Yes, we were teased, but not because I was Muslim, because I wasn't really a practicing Muslim growing up. It was more because I was Arab, and I have a funny name. It wasn't an ordinary name. And I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio in the 70s, yeah. And I lived in Parma, Ohio, which I understand is still white predominantly. So they haven't really diversified. My dad was a psychiatrist who worked there in the local psychiatric center. But I'm white, or appear to be white, although I don't identify as being white, whatever that means. And so I didn't struggle as much. But as soon as you put on the hijab, you become racialized. You become somebody of another culture. You become foreign. You become someone who doesn't belong here. Someone who is outside of the United States. So I didn't have that experience as much growing up.
Anita, remind us where you grew up.
I grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I was 18 during 9/11. So it was my 12th grade of high school. So I don't know if I can speak personally to living in to growing up in a post 9/11
Well,
context.
it seems to me actually you're right there on the cusp. So you have the experience of being a teenager before the 9/11 horror informed the American view on this subject. And then, you were a young woman in the immediate aftermath of that. Forgive me if this is did you see an immediate change in the way that you were perceived by classmates, friends?
My family had been living in this suburb of Minneapolis for a very long time. And so I went to preschool through high school in the same community. And so post 9/11, we got calls to our house saying, we just want you to make sure you feel welcome, you feel belonged, you are our neighbors, you're part of us. We had people pouring out love to our family because we had roots there. So, yeah, that was my experience.
And how about as you ventured farther afield? When I was reading your bio to folks, you've been all over the country and all over the world. So you've been in Minneapolis, you've been in Cairo, you've been in Morocco, you've been in Georgia, and that's the Georgia that's here in the United States as opposed to
Atlanta, Georgia,
yeah. So, did you, where you were not as familiar, was there a reaction there that you had to confront or contend with?
The transition from growing up in suburban Minneapolis, Minnesota, to going to Emory for undergrad was my first kind of like exposure to diversity. I was like the token brown kid in my class. There was like an adopted East Asian and then me. So I was like, I got to be whoever I wanted to be. People were really curious. They didn't really know much about Islam. I'd say my parents are from Pakistan. They'd say Palestine. I'd say I'm Indian. They'd think I meant Native American. So I really pre 9/11, and maybe this changed during like the Iran, I don't know if the Iran hostage crisis had anything really to do with this, or the first Gulf War, but I really felt like in my little bubble of Edina, Minnesota, I got to be the token diverse person and define that however I wanted to. When I got to Atlanta, it was a lot more, and Emory, it was a lot more diverse, and I met other South Asians. I realized my parents were not the typical South Asian parents at all. I thought they were so like foreign and weird and didn't get things, and then I realized, oh, they're pretty cool compared to some people's parents who want them to be a doctor and who have all this other pressure on their parents, or pressure on their kids. I didn't feel pressure from my parents professionally or anything like that. So I don't know if I can answer that question because my experience wasn't one of Islamophobia post 9/11.
All right. If a 17 or 18-year-old young woman who had grown up in the Muslim faith came to you in her first year at Stanford and said, I am feeling different from my classmates, and that difference is a source of discomfort, what would you counsel her?
What kid doesn't feel different?
Say it aloud, Maha.
What kid doesn't feel different? I mean, it's just sort of, part of being a teenager and being young, and still, yeah.
And if it was faith-based, Anita?
I'd ask some more questions because, I think there's some students that come through having serious existential questions about what they were told they believe and questioning their faith, right? And then there's others who get stronger in their faith because they find a faith kind of community and find others that they get along with because they've chosen this community versus, their parents making choices for them when they were, before they got to college. And then there's folks that are fine with, their faith doesn't strengthen or weaken, it's pretty much the same, but they're struggling with identity in other ways. They're struggling with talking about their faith or explaining who they are or answering questions to folks in the dorms late at night. I think the biggest challenge at college for most students, Muslim or not, is for a lot of them it's the first time they're around a very, very diverse group of people. Politically diverse, socioeconomically diverse, racially, religiously, culturally. People have very different set of values and they are sharing a room with that person or they're sharing, very intimate spaces. And I think that is what makes college challenging.
All right, here's a question. Maha, I'm going to start with you. And actually, I'm going to ask you a couple questions that are on the same card. In paradise, are men given virgins? Hang on. And then the follow-up is, what about women? What's their reward?
Women, trust me, women do not want a lot of men.
Well, because the follow-up to the follow-up.
We can hardly deal with one.
The follow-up to the follow-up is, will they, meaning women, continue to be married? So let's go to the issue of paradise.
In paradise?
Virgins.
Will women continue to be married in paradise?
Yes.
Okay. So paradise and heaven and hell for Muslims are generally considered to be, real things that will happen after the day of judgment in what is called the hereafter. So Muslims actually do believe that they will be resurrected and they will stand in a divine court of justice where they will be held accountable for their actions in this world. And this begins, you'll be held accountable for your actions after the age of puberty. Because when you're younger, you're basically following what the adults around you are telling you to do. But after the age of maturity, you're now able to reason for yourself what is right and what is wrong. And even if you've never heard the messages of God from different religions, I talked earlier about this concept of the fitra, this primordial human nature that you instinctively know what is right and wrong. And Muslims believe that this is what we'll be held accountable for, and both of these things are real for believing Muslims that actually follow the faith. And so people will end up in heaven or in hell. And we also, our view of God is that He's the compassionate, the merciful. The opening of every chapter in the Quran begins with, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. So we have a very loving relationship with God, that God forgives, God is compassionate and merciful, You have to be really, really, really bad to sort of, suffer the punishment of hell. And so heaven and hell are described in very similar ways that they are described in the Bible. And there are 7 layers of heaven and 7 layers of hell. And each of these layers are described differently. The highest layer of heaven is being in the presence of God. And that's all you need, right? That's the most beautiful place to be. And in other parts of heaven, it's described quite materially, where you'll basically get what you want. So the reference to this particular tradition, I've been told by scholars that it's actually not an authentic tradition. That that men will get so many virgins in heaven, but they will get what they want, and there are some men that do want that.
All right.
Right?
There's also a tradition of young, beautiful, with soft-skinned boys that'll bear milk or something. Can you speak to this?
Well, why don't you go ahead and...
That's all I know. That was enough. That was enough.
I find that difficult to believe that it's an authentic hadith for women, but maybe, I don't know. So I don't know all of the traditions around these issues, but people will get what they want. For someone like me, I want to be in the presence of God, and that's all I need.
I'm going to rescue you both and bring us back down to earth, okay? We have a number of questions about the role of women and the opportunity for women to play a role in leadership in the faith. A number of questions about whether or not women can be imams. A number of questions about what roles, if any, women play in what some refer to as the hierarchy of the faith. Anita, you want to begin on this, and then we'll go to Maha?
Sure. I think that...
Why don't you remind us what an imam is as a starting point to the conversation?
Sure. An imam is someone that can lead prayer and lead a congregational prayer so other people pray behind that person. Women can lead other women in most Islamic schools of thought, and men can lead mixed congregations or men. I think that here is a point where probably Maha and I differ, and probably I differ from a lot of mainstream Muslims in saying that I think we have a long way to go in women in leadership in mosques, in not just leading prayer as imams or imamas, but you just add A to everything and it becomes a feminine. So imama would be the feminine of imam. But also in things that aren't controversial, which is women being on boards of trustees and boards of directors and being presidents of their religious communities and community centers and taking more leadership roles. And I think that if you looked at the majority of mosques in the West right now, they're run by mostly men. And I think that needs to change. I think men need to make space for women, and women need to lean in or step up or whatever and take more of that space.
And is that lack of space, as you describe it, a function, again, of religious doctrine, or is it simply culture and tradition?
The leading of prayer, the imama piece, would be religious doctrine. The presidents of the cultural centers and on those boards and whatnot would be culture.
Okay, so the leading of prayer, I'm not sure that you would call it Islamic doctrine as much as it is an interpretation of jurisprudence in relation to leading congregational prayer. Traditionally, it's been interpreted that only men can give the sermon on Friday. Friday is the day of congregational prayer, similar to Sunday church services and Friday Shabbat services for Jews. And that only men can give the sermon for congregational prayer and then lead the prayer. That's been the tradition, right? Women today, and have always played leadership roles in the home. Even with the most, patriarchal man, the woman, the woman is sort of in control of the home situation. But women have played leadership roles in politics. In some Muslim majority countries, women occupy about 25% of parliament in some cases. The US is only 20%. And it was only about 5%, correct me if I'm wrong, it was only 5% in the 80s until women organized and got more women in parliament. So women have been political leaders, women have been scholars, women have done what I do. They head up organizations, they head up companies and so forth. It's the religious leadership that we're talking about, and women have played that role. But in this area, we're still stuck on that tradition where men are the only ones who can give the sermon and then can lead the prayer. Based on my reading and my understanding, and we actually don't differ at all, you just assumed that I did, there is nothing that I think bars women from getting up and giving the sermon in congregational prayer. And then as far as leading the prayer, the issue has always been the modesty. Well, a woman can stand in front of the women, right? In congregational prayer, you have to stand shoulder to shoulder. So that's the reason why there's separation of the sexes when you're in prayer. Depending on the space size, men can stand on one side and women can stand on the other side. But sometimes the space is so limited that men are standing in the front and the women are standing in the back. But they're touching shoulder to shoulder. Women are already scholars in the faith. So why not give them the opportunity to give sermons, and if they're going to lead prayer, stand in front of the women, right? Men can stand at the side, or they can stand in another room, right? No, seriously. And I think we need to have conversations about it. The tradition is they can't do that, and they're not talking about it. And if it were to happen today, I'm not sure that men would attend that mosque, unfortunately, because they would believe that they're violating the law, right? But I think that if you had women in religious leadership, I think that the mosque participation would double and triple and quadruple. That's what I think.
Because?
Because women's leadership is very special. I mean, when I want it, I go to the synagogues where you have Janet Martyr in the local synagogue here, or Rabbi Melanie Aaron. I go to Reverend George McDonnell in the local Presbyterian church. I think women bring in a different perspective on God's law and on religion, and I just think that I actually think that it would increase participation in religious communities if that were to happen. And it's a conversation that Muslims are not having at all. There are women that are breaking the tradition and leading the prayer of both men and women. It's happening at Stanford University already. It's happening a lot by young people. But I wish that we would have a conversation about it, because I'd like to be able to challenge the tradition and say, why not? Why can't women give the sermon? They're already scholars. They're fully qualified, as any man is. And then in terms of modesty, stand in front of the women and lead the prayer.
Let me ask a number of questions and thank you for the questions. We have so many. So I'm going to try and move into a little bit of a lightning round with shorter questions and shorter answers. So, what is expected of American women, business people, journalists, vacationers, when they visit Muslim-majority countries? Do we have to be escorted, covered? Why or why not? So, Maha, you've mentioned the 57 Muslim-majority countries, plus other countries, obviously, where there are significant Muslim populations. What should that mean for those who are not Muslim, who are visiting, traveling in these places in terms of their conduct?
Yeah. Visit TripAdvisor. Every place is different. Totally depends on where you're going.
Okay.
So true.
So if you want to know how to make your travel plans or where to catch a good comedy act, Anita is our source. Thank you. All right. What's the expectation of American Muslim women when they're on a date? When they're on a date, forgive me. So what is the expectation of American Muslim women when they're on a date? Are they...
Muslim men dating American women. Are we easier?
All right. When I said, all right, we're into the participatory town hall phase of the conversation tonight. Thank you. I think you get the gist of the question, though.
So I think that there's certain Muslim families that wouldn't even use the word date, right? You can talk to somebody, you can see somebody, but you're not dating. I don't know. There's certain expectations of, arranged marriages or an introduction by a family member, and then courting for in public places or in groups or something like that. That would be the more traditional conservative way a man and a woman would get to know each other. And then you have probably the majority of American Muslim folks under 30 in America dating on Tinder and Muslim versions of dating apps, but also all the other dating apps. And
excuse me, Anita, are there dating apps specifically geared towards young Muslim Americans?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And there have been for a really long time. So there was Shadi.com, like started back in the 80s maybe. I know people that have gotten married on Shadi.com. And now there's a bunch of like ones that work just like OkCupid and Tinder and Match and stuff like that. And a lot of people I know are getting married, meeting people on these websites or on meeting them on the general websites as well.
And what is the view of Muslim American parents, if there is a broadly held view, about dating and or marrying outside the faith?
Yeah, I think that varies too, depending on how kind of culturally committed that family is. I think certain families would say you need a certain person from a certain class, from a certain town, with a certain last name. And then some families that would say as long as the person's Muslim. And then there's other families that would say as long as the person's, speaks this one language. So I think there's a lot of variety. I think Islamically, there is a tradition where men can marry women of the book, so Muslim women, Christian women, and Jewish women, and women need to marry a Muslim man. And the sort of reasons for that is that religion is passed down genetically or whatever through the father. So it's okay for men to marry non-Muslims, and they don't need to convert because the kids will still be Muslim. But if a woman marries a man that doesn't convert to Islam, their kids won't be Muslim.
Well, if I expected a quick answer to these questions, I was clearly not mindful of all the different conversations that are taking place. Maha, your take on this same subject?
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that it's also because Islam believes in the prophets of Jews and Christians. And usually men in all societies tend to have a little bit of a higher authority in the family, and they could really have an impact on a woman in terms of her worship. So the thought is that if she's marrying a Muslim, the most important thing about the thought is that the most important thing about any relationship in marriage is your relationship with God, and you're supposed to preserve that relationship. So the thought is if a Muslim woman married a Muslim man, that her religion would be protected. But if she married a Christian or a Jew, it may not be protected, especially if that person becomes really religious and prohibits her from practicing her religion. So the idea behind it is to protect worship for a woman is why she's sort of required to marry a Muslim, whereas the other way, because Muslims respect the prophets of Jews and Christians, and we do, that a man has to respect the religion of his wife, if she's Christian or Jewish.
I want to go back to the question I asked earlier with the assist from the audience and ask you to make an assessment of Muslim men, and I think the question really was, essentially, do Muslim men end up dating outside the faith in the expectation that the women they're dating are somehow looser before they get serious and seek out a spouse who is then likely to be a Muslim woman? I think that really was the nature of the question. And so
I think douchebags do that, not just Muslim men. Douchebags in all religions do that.
Okay.
Like you could be the girlfriend, but you're not going to be the wifey because whatever. I think it's a douchebag problem.
Okay. There we go. That's my cue to move to some different questions, okay? Do young Muslim girls have a rite of passage, something like a bat mitzvah as an example?
I think generally, no, but in certain specific communities, yes. So in my specific community, yes, both men and women have a coming of age party.
Okay. Does the Quran allow polygamy?
So, monogamy is the norm. I want to emphasize that. Monogamy is the norm in Islamic law. God creates Adam and Eve. He doesn't create Adam, Eve, Betty, Jane, Mary, right? And then God talks about creating things in pairs throughout the Quran. So monogamy is the norm. Polygamy is mentioned in the Quran in the context of caring for orphans. That if you fear not taking care of the orphans, then you can take another wife, but you're obligated to treat your first and second equally in every way possible. And then in the same verse, God says, it's going to be difficult for you to do, so stick with one. No, seriously. Is that abused? Yes, it's abused by some Muslim societies, without a doubt, especially the very wealthy, rich. But monogamy is the norm, is what I wanted to point out.
Forgive me, but there are a couple of questions that specifically suggest that folks have heard or read that Islam or the Quran allows a man to have 4 wives, but a woman only 1 husband.
Great question. And the reason for that is that you would only take on another to be able to provide for them, because financial responsibilities fall on the man, not the woman, which is a sweet deal for women, right? So when a woman marries, no, it's not? All right. Well, I think it's great. But in marriage, the husband is the one who's obligated to support the family, the wife, the children. A man also has responsibilities for his parents, for his siblings. He's got much more financial responsibilities than a woman does. A woman, whatever she earns is her own. She can put it away, literally. She doesn't have to spend a dime on the house. If she does it out of the goodness of her heart, not because she's required to. Right? So a man would only take on another spouse to care for someone. And so that's the only reason. And so that's why this idea that a woman can marry more than one, monogamy is the norm in Islam.
I think one other thing to add, and I think most Muslims know somebody or have heard of somebody who is in a polygamous marriage. And so it's still happening. I wouldn't say it's common, but it's definitely still happening. I don't think it's happening any more than infidelity is happening outside of marriages that are monogamous. But there's also an Islamic requirement that the first wife knows and agrees before the man takes a second wife, and the second wife should know and agree that he already has a first wife, so that everybody should be it should be transparent, which oftentimes it's not. So that's.
And it needs to be
That's
public.
the difference between, I think, religion in theory and then religion in practice. Yeah. The one other thing that I was going to mention is the first Muslim marriage was a woman who was the boss, who was 25 years older than her employee, who asked him to get married, and who financially supported her husband. And they were a monogamous marriage until she died, and then the Prophet Muhammad took more wives after that. So he was in a monogamous marriage, was his first marriage, to a woman who was a widower, or widow. She was previously married, and she proposed. So I think that, there's, again, the most common and most apparent religious traditions, and then there's what's practiced. And if we went more towards what is the theory, it would look a lot different than the practice.
Question is, are there places around the world, particular countries perhaps, where there is a stronger women's movement or movement towards women's equality within Islam? Are there places you could point to on the map and say, there are some interesting things going on here?
Yeah, I mean, aren't there like 4 nations with women heads of states that are Muslim majority countries?
12.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
All right.
There are 12 Muslim majority countries have elected women. Bangladesh has elected women twice in a row. Indonesia, Turkey, Shamsah Schiller, Pakistan, you may all know Benazir Bhutto. You've heard of Benazir Bhutto because she was educated here in the United States. Mauritius, Singapore just appointed a woman president who wears the hijab. That's not a Muslim majority country, but they have a woman head of state. Several other countries, about 12.
And then the follow-up on this is there a feminist strain within Islam here in the United States?
Absolutely. So I consider Islam to be quite feminist, and I know that shocks people because how could you consider Islam to be feminist when all we've heard is what we've heard on it, about it?
So Maha, how could you consider Islam to be feminist?
Because I think that it gives women rights in its essence, in its beginnings. Women have had to fight for rights. Women were able to inherit 1,400 years ago. Women were able to be educated. Women were respected, were given respect. They weren't treated as property or chattel. In the environment that the Prophet Muhammad was preaching, women were treated as property. And he comes along and he's saying, no, women have dignity. Women have the same fitra as the men do. The same primordial human nature. They're human beings. They should be treated equally. Right? He says this 1,400 years ago. So Muslim women feminists actually go back to the tradition to point out that these are rights that are given to us by God, and we demand them in the societies in which we live. Big, you can correct me on this, Anita, the big feminist organizations exist in places in like Malaysia, Indonesia. Like one is called Sisters in Islam, another is called Masawa. Here in the United States, Karama is one which is made up of women attorneys. The contract, marriage in Islam is contractual, and as it is in Judaism as well. And so I used their contract when I got married to stipulate all of the things that I wanted to stipulate. My husband, always refers back to the contract. Is like, where are my rights? How come I didn't have anything to say in this? I said, too bad. I mean, I knew what my rights were, and I put them down. Another one is Wise by Daisy Khan. She's also, I think, doing really great work, reminding men to say, wait a minute, these are rights that were given to women, and we demand them. We demand them in our mosques. We demand them in our organizations. And the women that are doing work across the world in some of these Muslim majority countries are doing the same thing by referencing the Quran, by referencing hadith and early traditions, by referencing the Prophet's practice at the time, which is wonderful. And that's why I consider my religion to be a feminist religion.
Is Islam evolving? I mean, we've talked about the historic roots. We've talked about everything tonight and in the previous session, going back to the origins of Islam all the way to, what a 21st century teenager confronts. But is there an evolution of Islam that is underway? And if so, can you describe it for us, particularly with respect to women in Islam? What does the future look like, is what one person asks.
I can
Go ahead, yeah.
I can start the conversation. I see it in the literacy rates. The literacy rates of Muslim women around the world right now is not good. It is about as good as other developing nations, which is not very good. But when you look at the number of women that are in primary and secondary schooling and in university levels, it's equal to men, which is very, very exciting. And a lot of women are also going into STEM fields throughout the Muslim world, right? And that's really exciting as well. Political participation has always been there. Women working has always been there. The average rate of women working in Muslim-majority countries is around 40%, while in developing nations about 47%. But the employment issues really has to do with what I talked about earlier as far as the value of women working versus men working. They don't have any financial responsibilities to the family, so women decide to, even if they're working, they decide to stay home after they give birth to their, to children, and if they give birth to more than one, then they have the luxury of being able to stay at home because they didn't combine their income with their husband's income. But I am very hopeful with what I am seeing as far as the trends in education for women. There are equal numbers in schools, in secondary and in university, and they're also going into STEM fields.
And Maha, excuse me, but we have 2 or 3 questions from people who wondered, can Muslim women be teachers? And I'm not sure what prompted that question, but can Muslim women be teachers?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Of course, they're professors. And the second most educated group of women in the United States are Muslim women. I don't know if you know that or not. The group that is the most educated, the group of women most educated in the country are Jewish women in the United States. The second are Muslim women. Don't quote me exactly on this, but it's like something like 49% of Muslim women in the United States have college degrees compared to about 25% in the general population. Yes, it's
the number
amazing.
for the general population now, by the way, is up to about 33%.
Oh, okay.
And here in Santa Clara County, the number is probably close to 50%.
Oh, okay.
So we're,
All right.
but no, this is Silicon Valley. So
yeah,
if
yeah,
the number
yeah.
is,
So the Muslim women here probably are more educated as well. And as far as employment, 59% of Muslim women here in the country are employed. And so that just sort of goes to show that it's not because of religion that the literacy rate is low throughout the Muslim world. It really has to do with the fact that we live in a democracy. This is a developed society. Our industry requires both men and women out there to be working and well-educated, and we have public school education that's actually required, and so forth. And that's why we have the rates that we do here. Mm-hmm.
Can I add something to that? I think the question was more general, like, is Islam evolving, right? And I said this last week. I think that we're already behind the times. Like, we're not keeping up with the context that that most millennials are living in America. And so to tie up a couple things into one anecdote, Maha mentioned that at Stanford there is a women's led prayer. It's quite small, it just started, and there's a lot of resistance to it from the folks that go to the larger prayer. A women's led congregational prayer on a Friday. And it was started by an undergraduate student who said, I've started and sold my own company. She's majoring in something STEM. I've started and sold my own company. Why can't I lead prayer? And so she started it, and the Stanford Muslim community is having this conversation right now about can we accommodate both, or how do we fold it into, what's going to happen, what's the future of this is still to be determined. But we're having more and more folks, more and more educated, successful women saying, how come I can lead and move and shake in all other aspects of my life, and then I go to my mosque and I have to walk in a separate door and I have to stand in the back and I have to listen to a man who can't speak to me, who I don't relate to. And I think that we're already behind in this problem, and a lot of problems, and I think we need to get ahead of it, or we're going to lose a lot of this generation. They're just not going to show up. They're not going to identify as Muslim.
But don't you think that we're tackling that head on? Because now we have a new generation of American Muslims that are taking up these issues, and they're just going out there and doing it. So I'm not sure that I think that it's happening at the right time, right? Maybe in my generation, it wasn't an issue. My mother would never have questioned anything that's happening in the mosque because that's just the way that it is, and she was fine with that. In her generation, it was fine, but in this next generation, it isn't, and they're taking it up. So I'm not sure that I would say that it's behind the time. I think it's coming at the right time for American Muslims.
Another question, because I want to try and wrap us up here in about the next 5 minutes, and we have way too many great questions, and thank you again. Does Islam have a view about LGBTQ issues, including, and there were a couple questions, transgender issues? Does Islam have a view on the subject?
I think this is why you're seeing more and more third spaces, places like the Markaz, the center that I direct at Stanford, which is not a place for prayer, which is not a place for ritual, precisely because there's space for queer, trans, gender nonconforming folks. We don't have to split into men and women and have people feel like, I don't fit in that binary. So I think we're seeing queer, trans, Muslims claiming their own spaces, finding allies with other communities, and that's why there's these non-mosqued or unmosqued spaces that are becoming more of community hubs.
Maha, any thoughts?
I thought she did a great job.
All right.
No. Let me be direct about it. So traditionally, Islam treats this issue the same way that traditional Christianity and traditional Judaism treated it. Islam is, I think, a little bit more compassionate about it in the sense that it says, listen, sexuality is a private matter. You know, it's just a private matter. It's none of anyone's business. The idea of identifying by your sexual orientation would be foreign to Muslim communities and Muslim majority countries, and some countries are quite harsh about it. But the majority are, surprisingly, are not. It's considered a private matter, none of anyone's business. And that's the way that sort of, you know, Muslims generally treat the issue. Yeah.
Are there Muslim women, either here in the United States or abroad, that you particularly admire and would want to call out as sort of exemplars?
Hudo here, see?
Okay. All right. Maha, any?
Malala is probably one that's quite famous. And I think we forget the fact that she's really backed up by her dad. She couldn't have done what she's been able to do around the world and speak out. And she's now, I think, at Oxford University, if I'm not mistaken, without her father's support. And I think people forget that. I think, you know, Muslim men are shortchanged as being always, you know, patriarchal or being oppressive and so forth. It's just not true at all. One of the things that I remember distinctly when I first walked into a mosque as an adult, I grew up in a very secular home because my dad just wasn't really practicing and my mother wasn't practicing. And I remember, this was in my early 30s now, I walk into the mosque for the first time and I remember how well I was treated by the men and how they invited me in to consult on their board and become part of the community and so forth. And I remember feeling, what is it about these men that I'm so comfortable with? Because in the corporate world, it's, you know, I was in the corporate world for about 7 to 8 years. It was all about, I was always concerned about my looks and honest to God, it was just all about, because I felt like I was being treated and defined by that. And I was a marketing analyst. Not so with these men, and I remember that, and I'm finding that that's also the case, I think, with practicing Christians and practicing Jewish men and so forth. But I felt very comfortable in that space because they treated me with so much respect and so much regard and so much dignity. And it was a new experience for me.
I really have so many questions that I want to try and do these very quickly, even if we can't do justice to the complexity of the questions. So, quickly, is God male?
No, and I don't know why we use the male pronoun he for God.
All right. Is birth control acceptable in the Islamic faith?
Yes.
And is there a visible sign that a Muslim woman is married, like a wedding ring, for example?
It's cultural.
Okay. Those were 3 quick questions and 3 quick answers.
Also, abortion is permissible in Islam. The first trimester for any reason, the second trimester for health reasons. Always for health reasons. Oh, yes, second and third for health reason, first trimester.
If folks wanted to learn more about women and Islam, where would you direct them?
Sign up for the Marka's website. We do a lot of great programming on women in Islam. Actually, this coming Wednesday, day after tomorrow. Today's Monday, yes. On the 25th, we are doing a talk on the role of women in the nation of Islam, which is an American-born African-American tradition. So we have a scholar of history from UC Berkeley named Eula Taylor coming. We're serving dinner. It's 5 to 7. I don't know if we can host all of you, but you can find out more about the great programming we do if you go to markaz.stanford.edu. M-A-R-K-A-Z, markaz.stanford.edu. There's a place you can sign up for our newsletter, and you're always welcome to any events that are public in the newsletter.
Maha, I have apparently offered up a marketing opportunity, so go right to it.
So if you're an educator, if you're teaching in middle and high schools, and if you're a university professor, we actually have great lesson plans, and one of the lesson plans is on women, which begins with looking at the status of women in these 57 Muslim majority countries, and then it goes from there. It's really quite rich. We have a lot of content on our website, ing.org. We also have answers to frequently asked questions about Islam, and there's an entire section on women. We also speak across the Bay Area. We're the largest speakers bureau in the country. We have affiliates in different parts of the country. Ours is the largest, so we're always speaking, and so if you look at our featured events, you'll see when we're speaking. I'm one of about 50 speakers in the area. Tomorrow night, I'm speaking at Menlo Park Library on Islamophobia, if you are interested in that, in that conversation.
All right, thank you. And I was asked at the last session, after the last session, if there were books out there that people could go to, and the answer is there are a great many. One that is a particular favorite of mine is The Muslim Next Door by Sambul Ali Karamali. It is available at the library, it's available at local bookstores, and she is a local author and was on our panel last year. A big question, but a quick answer, please. And I'm hearkening back to our last session. The biggest misconception that you confront about women and Islam. Yeah. Maha, briefly.
That my hijab is forced or imposed upon me. Just the opposite. My family would rather that I don't wear the hijab, the scarf. My husband is always concerned about me and would prefer that I don't. I choose to dress traditionally.
Anita, excuse me.
That Muslim women don't date.
Okay.
Hasn't been an issue for me, but you know.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you. Thank you. Thank you all very much. We did get a question from someone who wondered, will this be available online? The answer is absolutely. That's one of the reasons why we're taping. Last year's 3 programs are currently available online. If you go to supervisorsemidian.com, speaking of marketing opportunities, if you go to supervisorsemidian.com, we will have all 3 of these up. And I could tell from your spontaneous applause that you enjoyed and appreciated this evening's program. Again, with thanks to the Mountain View Human Relations Commission, who has been our partner in all of these conversations. And would you join me one more time, in thanking our 2 wonderful panelists, Anita Hussain, Maha El-Jannati. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week, 7 o'clock Monday, right here. Thank you all. Have a good evening.